Welcome to our global audience that's joined in to talk to us today. We are the Reuters Institute, and we're here to talk about our most recent research, which is around climate and audiences. It feels like a politically fraught item to be discussing, particularly the way 2025 has begun. But it's been important for us at the Reuters Institute because it is an iteration of our own study of how audiences in some of the key countries that we looked at are engaging with climate news, what makes sense for them, what works, what doesn't work, and what indeed they're thinking about when they're looking at climate news. Why is this important? We believe it is critical not just because of what it means for news organizations and how they should be communicating to their audiences, but also to highlight the fact, and maybe I'm giving the headline away, that across the 8 countries, it is the news media where people engage with climate news the most. There is reason for us to remain committed to this. And maybe I'm sort of hinting at an optimistic tone over here, but we will delve into that. I'm Mitali Mukherjee. I'm part of the Reuters Institute, and it is my great joy today to introduce our panelists so that we can dive right into this conversation. Dr. Vikas Ajaz, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the Reuters Institute. He is the lead author of this report, the one who we have had many, many arguments and debates about on what we should and shouldn't have in this report. Welcome, Vikas. Ivan Kurin, who is part of the crack team at AFP that looks at climate and is looking to change the world one climate story at a time. Ivan, such a pleasure to have you. Thank you for being here quite serendipitously, which is great. Absolutely, and a good one. And Catherine Dunn, who is part of the Oxford Climate Journalism Network. I don't think for the 700 people from the network who've joined in, she needs any introduction, but she has been sort of in the trenches herself as a journalist who's covered energy. She tracks climate, and she works very, very closely with all the journalists in the Oxford Climate Network. I know we have an hour, which tends to sort of fly, so maybe we'll get right into it. I think, Vikas, first, it's really important to set some context on why we chose to do this report. Just for the sake of our audiences that have joined in, we consciously chose 8 countries that we thought were a very good mix of both global majority and minority. We wanted to explore whether climate meant something different as a subject for audiences, whether you were living in Germany or you were in India or Pakistan. So that's the reason we had these 8 countries. And we wanted to explore, didn't we, Vikas, what the relationship for audiences is specifically around climate news. Tell me your big sort of takeaway, a big highlight from it, because you've been really in the weeds of it for the last 3 years now with this data.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. I think the one thing that stood out, and we have highlighted in the report as well, was how remarkably stable people have been, both in terms of engaging with the topic of climate change and how their attitudes have been over the past 3 years, because this is what we have been doing across 3 years. We have been looking into different ideas on how people engage with climate change as a topic, and then what it does to them. While, for example, consuming news it happens when you consume news, or it doesn't. And we have, over the period of time, we have covered a range of different issues. And what, for me, which stood out this year was in the backdrop of increased intensity of extreme weather events, increased frequency of extreme weather events. 2023 being on record, the hottest year ever recorded. And then 2024 was again topped 2023 record as well. So in the backdrop of such drastic changes that we are seeing, I did not see that among people. There was a disconnect, what I felt, that people have kind of stopped paying attention, the urgency of the crisis, or probably they have sort of a ceiling effect that's the best people could come up with in terms of engaging with that topic. So that was, I guess, my sort of a surprise, main finding. And now that I have published the work, we are now looking a bit deeper into what are the different reasons could have been to explain such inertia, this is what we are calling climate perception inertia in the report. So this is how I sort of say that this is one key takeaway for me on the report.
Yeah. Mentioning and outlining, that's the double-edged sword of it, isn't it? It's still sort of 3/4 of respondents saying they do believe this is important, but the fact that for the 3 years we've been tracking this data, it hasn't moved. And as you say, in the face of extreme weather events, not just heat, but also flooding, also fires to some degree, it's quite surprising to see that sort of response. Kat, for the network and for the 700 journalists that we speak with about climate on a daily basis, is this something you're hearing sort of echoed across newsrooms saying, I get it, it does feel like the biggest story of our lifetimes, but it doesn't seem to be moving ahead?
Yeah, it was interesting because when I saw the results of the study, I did think, it's not just like vibes. No, it really is this feeling of, why are we struggling to break through?
Yeah.
And I think what we have with a lot of newsrooms, what's notable is that we're a self-selecting group, right? People apply to the OCGN because they want to deal with this. They want to report on this. So we get very enthusiastic people. And there are some real standout newsrooms. Yvonne's going to talk about AFP, where we see a real difference. But for a lot of the newsrooms, in a way, we are still hearing the same things that we heard back in 2022 when we started, which is that people come in, Russia invaded Ukraine, full-scale invasion and at the start of the OCGN. And we had people coming in saying, my editors say this isn't interesting, saying we have bigger problems, saying people aren't interested. Like, I think a lot of these are actually myths or things that we have to dissect a little bit more, but they're very, very, very pervasive and they are affecting climate journalism. And in that sense, it's no different than what we were hearing 3 years ago. Definitely, there are some bright spots. People are coming out, they're doing something different, they're trying something different. And compared to 3 years ago, we have a lot of answers. We have a lot of tangible things we can point people to. And that's what's really different. But that is also frustrating, honestly, because we have really, really tangible examples and we have newsrooms that are doing it successfully and it's working. So there's no excuse anymore, really.
Yeah.
And I think I want to do a shout out to our colleague, Greg Cochran, who works with the alumni. We were talking yesterday, and Greg is an amazing journalist who works on climate and culture and music. And, he's one of the only people who works at this intersection. And he was talking about how, in the Grammys, the fire icon, nobody was saying the words climate change. And that is like really hard to grapple with. How can you have a city be, have parts of it raised to the ground and nobody is saying these words? So yeah, I think it should be a moment of reflection, actually.
And a moment of comparison, Yvonne, because you've got countries like France where engagement amongst our respondents seem to be much higher, at the higher end, whereas you have a country like the US that's probably emerged from, let's say, a somewhat toxic relationship with political news and the elections, and climate news engagement has actually dropped off a cliff. Interestingly, that's something that gets echoed in our data from Germany as well, where you are beginning to see a much less sort of relationship between the audience and climate than we saw even 2 years back. What is France doing right?
France is really interesting. I think the landscape in France has changed, but very recently. In the past, everything happened in the past 2 to 3 years. In the past 2 to 3 years, a lot of news organizations in France, and in 2022, we had major heat waves in France.
Yeah.
So I think that impacted the public's perception of climate. And at the same time, in the past 2 years, major news organizations, broadcasters, adopted a climate strategy, but a full corporate editorial climate strategy. They appointed climate editors, they restructured, reorganized their newsroom. And now every night on French TV at 8 p.m., evening news, the top 2 channels, you have good quality climate content every single day.
Yeah.
So it's changing. And also, one thing I was intrigued in the report is that television news is on top.
Yes.
Isn't it amazing? I mean, so that tells me the old world isn't dead, right? Legacy media. So, and what was the number? I think 50%.
50%.
Said somewhat or strongly trust news media for information on climate.
Yeah.
So it's not massive, but it's still something, right? It's half of people who still trust the media
Can I
and more
scratch
trust the
that?
science.
Yeah, can I scratch that point you made about including and representing climate news and sort of quality climate news a little bit. I think one of the frustrations we hear both from our journalists at the network and more widely is, I've done it, I've done the hard work, I put the climate story out, but nobody's clicking. Are you getting something different from your audiences when you do make the effort to put out that kind of content?
Yes, so we're a news agency, so we distribute our content to
Yeah.
news organizations. So when they pick up our stories, it's because they think their readers will want to read about it. And I'll give you concrete examples. Before taking this job, I heard that COPs, boring and everyone turns off from COP coverage. I looked at the data. During the last two COPs, the last three COPs, this is among every day during COP, it was among the top 3 or 5 stories of any news stories we put out there during that period. We had at the same time Gaza, Ukraine, the Trump transition, and still COP coverage is always on top or near the top. So let's see the data before thinking.
I was smiling a little bit because
Yeah,
our research tends
that's
to
good.
point a different way with COP, but we can talk about that. Because I think the big chunky item when we were sort of discussing what the research should and could look at was extreme weather. And that's the other one that's difficult to get a handle on, as you said right at the start, where across the 8 countries, there was a very, very keen understanding that extreme weather was impacting our respondents, it was impacting their families, but it doesn't seem to have translated into a clearer connection with climate change.
Yeah, one of the things that, again, I mean, there are a lot of things to unpack, but this was a bit of surprising to me because we hear from the news media, of course, there's A thing happened here, B thing happened here. So a lot of continuous frequency of extreme weather events across the globe, and the number is growing. But what we saw in the data was that people are still, I mean, between 20 to 40% across all, or at least 4 different types of events that we ask about: hurricanes, floods, extreme heat. They have always been, they haven't seen the change in be it their own ability to cope or understand the risk such extreme weather pose. They haven't seen any change in the occurrence of these extreme weather events in how government handles such crises. And they haven't even, so there is a small shift event to event and then country to country, because of course, when you're talking about floods, it is much more prevalent across all countries that we are looking into. But then when we are talking about wildfire, you don't hear wildfires happening in Pakistan, for example. So people's affinity to such events makes sense, that there's less affinity of such events or occurrence of such events in specific countries. But overall, for me, it was kind of it was something to ponder on, that there is a large majority, still not majority, but significant number of people are still do not see this as it has changed, or these events are changing the way they need to think about both their personal capacity to deal with it, their risk assessment, or the government's ability to handle that. So I think this is somehow, and I don't know, I mean, we can go back and discuss what you mentioned about COP, because as Mithali mentioned, we have some data that points to a different direction. But I think there is a lot that needs to be done, because the media, and we looked further down in the report that how does these public perception towards the extreme weather events kind of linked to their daily news consumption. And we did not see a lot of variation, except in one, which was people who consume more news, they are much more likely to see the risk of these extreme weather events. That was the only bit where I saw that the more news you consume, the more likely it is that you have this understanding that the risks are going higher. Other than that, in terms of government response, in the personal capacity, how to deal with it, or this change in severity of extreme weather event, it has nothing to do with how media cover these
I
issues.
want to pull that thread out, exactly that one a bit more. And, for people who are joining in online, I want to go over that line in our report, which is to say that respondents who consume climate news more frequently are more likely to view extreme weather events as worsening and to feel personally at risk. And that probably speaks back to the greater challenge for news publishers, which is news avoidance in the first place, which is people not coming and engaging with news in order to feel like they have either, a keener understanding of these extreme weather events or the causes of it or the impact of it. That speaks to a larger challenge, doesn't it?
It does. And we have some data that suggest why people are not so engaged. Well, first of all, we need to sort of contextualize it. The news media specifically is dealing with declining news trust in general and increase in news avoidance. And it is regardless of any type of news avoidance. So, and of course, climate is also part of the agenda these days. So if we are seeing this increased avoidance, that should be put into the context. And you're right, this issue continues to be a big one for the news organization. But one of the reasons, or some of the reasons that come up in our data is like people see that because it negatively impacts my mood, so I'm avoiding news, climate news. And another, at least if I'm remembering the number right, it's 27% people said that there's nothing new for me in climate news stories. So that's why I'm avoiding news. And then the third bit was, I don't trust media. But I don't pay too much attention on that because this is something, media can be victim of low trust anytime or on any specific topic. But I think these 2 or 3 things, which are the effective engagement or the emotional response, how people consume climate news, and overall the lack of newness. And I have over the years grappled with the idea that how come news organization kind of bring the newness in a story. And to be fair with the people, they're not wrong. I mean, you have a wildfire and there's so much you can incorporate the newness in it. I mean, that's about it. So I think there is some sort of a disconnect in what people, when they consume climate news, they have a sort of a different kind of understanding what it could be, whereas they are not fully equipped to understand how news media maybe work, be it any climate beat or any other beat. So I think that somehow kind of impact how people are still disengaging themselves from climate change news.
Because I'm sort of in the lucky position of only throwing the questions and not providing the answers, Ivan, let me draw you in on that, which is, and you and I spoke, a few weeks back about heat, for example, the fact that newsrooms weren't quite equipped to be handling the kind of heat in which they were reporting. What can we do to provide sort of newness and nuance and something for someone who isn't engaged with the news, but might, as one believes, be part of the younger generation that is engaged with climate?
No, I think, right, I think people can feel that sometimes it's repetitive. No one wants to read the same story twice, or let alone 3, 4, 5 times. So I always say the most important climate event of the year for the media is not COP. It's the summer. This is what we have to prepare for. So I'm not preparing COP at all right now. I'm preparing the summer. And so news organizations should have a plan. We know there's going to be extreme weather event this summer, and summer is already in the southern hemisphere right now. Summer in the northern hemisphere is starting. You can have a heat wave in April, right? So there's a list of things you should do. Do you have guidelines, like written guidelines for your newsroom, not just for your climate reporters, but for the people who are going to cover the flooding or the heat wave?
Or covering an election rally in the middle of June, which is sort of intense.
Or your education reporter who's going to cover schools closing because it's too hot. So have you trained your journalists? Have you talk to your business editors, your political editors? Because they're going to cover this. It's going to be breaking news when schools close and when there's a disaster and the government response is not up to the task. So you have to prepare all of this. And there's a lot of safety also. And this is something at AFP we're developing very, very strongly. like literally, how are you gonna dress when you're gonna cover that fire?
Mhm.
Like what kind of clothes do you have to wear? How do you park your car near a fire? So we have our own guidelines. I mean, a lot of organizations do. But how much water do you take when you go in Brazil cover a flood? Like for how many days do you take food? How are you going to recharge your batteries? All of this. This needs to be prepared.
And Kat, this is the interesting one, which is that again, in the research that we conducted, we found there was a greater preference for local news, but I think I would broaden that to actually imply personal relevance. And I want to do a mea culpa because I'm the one who always says every story is a climate story, a business story is certainly a climate story. Does it feel like that's not the case when you speak to journalists, that it's not sort of, I can't insert climate everywhere, but I can bring personal relevance to a story and then engage with the climate side of it?
I still think most stories can be a climate story. It's all just about maybe I'm like not every story. No, not every story, but a line. Often when we're telling people put more climate and they think, well, this and the angle, and I say, it's a line. You know, the LA fires, maybe every story it'll be a practical stuff, insurance, it'll be about all this stuff. Sometimes all you need is a line. Sometimes it is such low-hanging fruit. And like I have a connection there, but I want to go back to like what Yvonne said, which is, so last year we did an annual event on heat, and I thought I knew about heat, but I was like, oh, wow, this is not just this is bad, but this is something we can prepare for and something we should prepare for. And for newsrooms where we try not to be prescriptive about what they should do, one of the things we started like really saying is like develop a heat strategy. Climate might feel really big, really political, really complex, but start with heat, because I want to know it's July 4th. I want to know, can I go for a run? Will my dog go into heat stroke if I take him out? If somebody's pregnant, should they go outside? Like these are really, really, really tangible choices that people are making about their health. And that is why we need heat coverage. And so I'm Canadian, I'm from Western, wildfire coverage. Like what boots do you need? The Aussies have figured this out, but like you need your boots not to melt. That's the kind, in California, they were wearing the wrong masks. They need to be go to Home Depot and get the right mask. Like this is stuff we can prepare for, we should prepare for. It is dangerous, but is also the stuff that like, it is a life and death issue, right? And for public broadcasters, this is like what we are there to do at the end of the day. And like, we need to be giving people that information. And if climate feels too big and feel too complicated, start with heat. And also you can do buildings, you can do infrastructure, you can do sports. We did loads on the Olympics last summer. How did the Olympics train, the Olympians train if Paris was going to be 40 degrees? Like they all had to train, they had to prepare to not pass out on the tennis court. So it's just really, really, really tangible. And I think also it goes back to local news. When people say they want local news, they're not getting it because the media ecosystem, they're saying they want stuff that's useful. Tell me, can I take my dog for a walk? Like, how scared do I need to be if I'm pregnant and it's 40 degrees?
Like food inflation, right? What happens to the prices of fruits and vegetables and why? Sorry, did you want to come in on a point?
Yeah, so climate, okay, is part of every story, but let's be very careful when we write, and because you don't want a legal disclaimer kind of effect at the end of at the bottom of a story. Scientists say climate change, blah blah blah. Maybe people we're in a different time today, and I think we have to be careful about the language. And I think one way to address that is to be very concrete and say, okay, the Gulf of Mexico has never been hotter. And this is how it's feeding the intensity of storms. And this is much more efficient, and it's less, maybe for some readers, it's going to be more acceptable as language and as efficient. I think it's win-win because you explain the mechanism without talking about climate change in general, which might seem abstract, and some people may, reconsider.
So not everything is, but some events are climate facing, such as COP, Vikas, and we were, quite interested and intrigued to see what the data would look like, because while the survey was out was when COP was actually underway. So you would think there was a lot bubbling in terms of news and information, but there were two sort of I don't want to say downers, but two learnings, one on COP engagement and the other on how young people
Yeah.
perceive COP.
Well, if anybody who is very enthusiastic about COP, he should read our report, because there's a lot of positive things that people actually feel about COP. I don't know. This could be because of their social desirability bias, which basically means that when they are filling out the surveys, they want to look the greener than the next guy, basically. So they want to come off as, I am the biggest climate enthusiastic, so that's how I want to respond to this survey. But all in all, what we have seen I have seen and worked with a lot of different people. This is now pretty much kind of established fact that climate change across the media, across different countries, is very episodic. So when you have different events like COP, you certainly see the jump. So what Ivan was mentioning was pretty much the result of that sudden interest, and people want to. It's a big event. And we went in with the same hope that maybe we would see a sort of a jump across people's news consumption back in 2 years, when in 2022 and 2023, we fielded the questionnaire in a different time.
Yeah.
This time it coincidentally overlapped with, at least in some countries. So I was hoping to see that uptick.
Yeah.
I did not see that. So which is reaffirming the fact that, again, there is a ceiling that people want to commit to the idea, regardless of how big the event is.
Yeah.
And the second is that COP is not generating anything additional news worth information for people. And frankly, this last COP was pretty much, I mean, call me pessimistic or not, but that I did not see anything good that come out of the COP, at least the last one. Okay, in Dubai, probably, but I mean, people are right not to engage or suddenly show us that, oh, there is a strong sudden uptake in we are very much excited
Yeah.
just because COP is happening.
Yeah.
I did not see that. And there are many, many reasons. And as you mentioned about young people, we can go into a lot of details. Why is it the case? But young people are usually a lot more optimistic, I would say. So I think that's what we see in the data as well, their optimistic take on the COP.
The word for you is not pessimistic, Vikas, it's diplomatic.
I
But
take it.
for the sake of our online audience, I am going to rattle off some of those numbers again, and then we can talk a bit about it, which is that on average across 8 countries, 14% had never heard of COP. 21% acknowledged they had heard but knew nothing about it. A majority, 61%, said they did know something about it. And within the young respondents, they were more likely to view COP positively. But I think it's important to say that a notable 53% of that young population, which is 18 to 24, still view COP as a major failure for the climate, a sentiment that sort of tended to increase with age. I guess the question, that struck me when we were processing all this, and Ivan and Kat, I'd love to hear from both of you, is whether it was COP a town square moment, and is it no longer that? And do we need an alternate town square moment, which sort of brings people together to talk about climate, where you are talking about climate? It's not a sentence being inserted. It's not an also wanted to say.
I think our expectations for COP are too high.
Too high.
Too
Scratch that.
not being a town square. No.
Yeah.
Your town square is when you had the Fridays for Future demonstrations, when you have some kind of a major climate event in the country. This is when you
that is the town square.
This is when you have the debate, maybe. I mean, they're having a debate on rebuilding Los Angeles. They had a huge debate in Valencia after the floods, right? So this is where you have the national conversation.
Yeah, I think COP is really interesting. We do a lot of preparation with the members on COP and we get them to invite their editors and planning conversations, and people are going to do it really differently, right? If they're specialists or they're not. But I also think, the last few COPs were maybe not the best and rallying moment. They felt a little
More
bit,
diplomacy, yes.
yeah, the whole, a lot of fossil fuel, a lot of suppression of civil society wasn't a great vibe, I would say. I think expectations going into this last one were incredibly, incredibly low. But yes, I think one of the things that I always think about with the DNR and past reports is sometimes some of the COP coverage, it's replicating some of the elements of political journalism that in every single digital news report, audiences are saying they do not like.
Mhm.
So what, you know, we know climate's can be a very difficult topic. We know politics right now is a very difficult topic. Why are we using the same formula? It is maybe a very North American term, inside baseball. It is real, you know, if you're running, if you're working for a political blog, a climate blog, you can get in the weeds, but for regular people, this is photos of Boris Johnson, this is people meeting, they may as well be covering G7 in Davos with an apocalypse sort of tone to it all. It's just, you know, like a live blog on COP. I would just say, do not waste your money or time. Watch the big themes. We tell people go and source, go and get loads of ideas, but like it's got to feel local, it's got to feel tangible. And I think if we could trade out a few less COP stories for a few more local biodiversity stories that sometimes editors think are actually quite soft and fluffy. We talk to scientists over and over and over again, and they say for the lowest hanging fruit that will make the biggest difference tomorrow, go out into your local community and write a local biodiversity story about somebody restoring their local park. And you might think it sounds like, what difference will that make? We'll all be dead tomorrow, you know, forget it. No, like these are the stories that actually have a lot of science behind them. And I think if you read these stories, you do feel better. So that's what I would say about COP. We're not going to stop doing them. They're big geopolitical themes and there's loads of money. But yeah, throwing all of our eggs in the COP basket, I don't think is.
And I think what you're saying
that's
goes
gonna
right
work.
back to the point in the report as well, authored by Waqas, which is about personal relevance. Ivan, I want to talk a little bit about how to tell these stories, because that's the other takeaway. Just as we've seen with our larger audience surveys, it is video that is the most popular form, and this sort of cuts across age groups that we looked at. It is short form video that they seem to be engaging with more. Is that the syntax we need to be thinking about when we're talking about climate?
Yeah, I mean, and also you have to think, we have to make sure we do stories that robots won't be able to do, right? So you have to be on the ground and, you know, because you still need humans to shoot that story and take pictures. And so, I mean, I can only talk about what we do.
Yeah.
We try and always send, you know, a text reporter and a photographer and a VJ on every assignment. Because that's what the media want, right? They want a very visual story. And we kind of split between impact stories, climate change impact stories, and responses. But this is really hard to find original angles, right? Because I think that's boring news avoidance.
Yeah.
Right? You don't want to do always the same stories, and this is where it's really hard. And so you need to build literacy in your newsroom. You need to train them. You need to have guidelines. You need to go. We have a checklist at AFP. Well, is this a real response to climate change? Is it replicable? Is it? I mean, it's basically inspired by solutions journalism, right?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, and use a lot of data as well.
Yeah, it's a good segue, Waqas, to talk about our findings on misinformation. I know that a lot of the scientific community we've been interacting with have sort of felt it more keenly, I think, in the last year and a half, the kind of pushback they've faced on climate-related conversations or climate-related research. What did we find around misinformation specifically?
It's a very, very hot thing to talk about misinformation in general, and then climate misinformation is also kind of something that people would want to know about, because a lot of the time we attribute inaction on, be it on the governmental side or on people's behavior change, we attribute this to, oh, they must have come across some sort of misinformation on climate change. Oh, there is no climate, there is no consensus among scientists, so on and so forth. So we wanted to, we have been doing it for the last 3 years. And again, across 3 years, it's stagnant. Whoever believed in all those climate-related misinformation, I wouldn't say he's the same person, but that person continues, or a similar kind of percentage is across 3 years at aggregate level. And when we look at within countries, things do not change. So people who were, for example, some countries are very much, more people were like, we are exposed to misinformation on climate change in high 40s. They continue to be the same case. But I think it's worth mentioning that sort of the caveat here is this is the perceived misinformation. I think the information I'm getting is a misinformation. So I'm not 100% sure, because the follow-up question to this we normally ask is, how much do you think that you have come across? How frequently you come across? And we don't have, on average, it's like 20-25% people say that I come across climate misinformation frequently. So it is out there. It is in different pockets of our information ecosystem. I won't diminish its impact, but I don't exaggerate it as well. It is not, we need to talk about that. But if you ask me honestly, there are very few people in very few places with very few attributes in common who are both engaging with that kind of information, consume that kind of information, and then spread it across the information landscape.
And I think it's worth mentioning for some of these countries like India, in general, levels of concern around misinformation are very high.
Yep.
India and South Africa, as we found consistently. So it seems to sort of also extend into
Yep.
climate-related news. I'm going to pause with my questions because there's a whole bunch of them coming in online. And thank you to Diego Arguedas Ortiz, who runs the Oxford Climate Network, for sort of supporting with sending these questions across. Glad to have you here in presence in some sort. Muriel Thornton, and I know, Vikas, this is something we debated last year, has a question around, could you discuss how audience responds to coverage of climate activism?
We had it.
At you, Germany.
We looked at this specifically, and we had, Just Stop Oil and the protests around that. So what we call direct action, not we, but GSO, Just Stop Oil themselves, term them as disruptive protests or direct action protests. We also have some of the questions in this, but we haven't really published that in the report. We'll be doing that later on. I think overall, such protests are not very much welcomed among public. There is a very strong opposition. Majority of people, and when I say majority, I mean we're talking about more than 60-65% people who are not supportive of such disruptive direct action protests. It doesn't really matter how, is it throwing soup on sunflower or is it gluing yourself on the road? This is not the way people see this. And some countries are have a more strong opinion towards that compared to the others. For example, Germany being, it's 2 years data, and we still see that Germans are somehow, they are very against this idea of disruption. And we continue to look into this, and I think there is a lot to unpack here, but I hope I have the answer, because I can't really go much into the detail how people normally have much more nuanced information. There's one bit more perhaps is that we ask people, do they think that media covers their coverage of such events fairly or not? Well, this is also something that people consider, that media's criticism on such events is fair. So because those who do not support such activism, they also think media is covering these events as fairly, regardless how negative or how critical that coverage is. Mm-hmm. So that kind of aligns with people's expectation on the activism side.
Ivan, there's a question from Ronojoy Mazumdar, who's also a former network member, saying, what are your views on tailoring climate journalism to niche audiences of the already hyper climate aware, instead of seeking to inform the broad public? Is there a model to explore to provide sort of high quality information, news and perspective on climate?
I mean, that's not what we want to do.
Yeah.
We're a general news organization. And so we try and make it as broad as we can, meaning it has to be understandable by anyone. So that means using simple language, concrete, not abstract words, a very human level. So, but it doesn't mean that a tailored, that was the word, right? A tailored niche audience is not interested in what we do. When we do a very, very, we did a very nice story out of Pakistan about monsoon brides, which I can send you the link.
Please do, but tell us about it for people.
So it's in Pakistan, and it's about families before a major flooding. They would marry their young daughters to get the dowry.
Yeah.
Yes.
This is a climate story, right? This is climate finance story almost. And so this is very, I'd never seen that story elsewhere. This fits really well with the people who are extremely climate focused, but anyone can read it.
Yeah. I think it's also worth mentioning that even in our broader research, the challenge is not that the hyper sort of served are not being served enough. I think there's more than enough information for those who are right at the top end of the pyramid. I think the challenge is that a lot of sections feel quite separate from the news environment. They don't feel reflected or represented. I don't think they see personal relevance. So just want to add that in. Vikas, there is a question from Pakistan, so I'm just taking the liberty of throwing that one at you. Despite our vulnerabilities in Pakistan, the report shows that views on serious climate impacts have dropped by 8 percentage points. I'm interested in hearing the experts expand on that decline. Is it more about the last climate's events fading in sort of proximity and I guess impact, given that it happened almost 3 years ago, or are there other reasons? And I imagine the arrow is being pointed towards political chaos.
Frankly, there's no rocket science to it. Since the flooding in 2022, a lot has changed, of course, both politically and in terms of climate change as well. And I think partially it is the environment to blame, the political environment to blame, and secondly, how the media actually works in Pakistan. We were talking about heat earlier. I mean, in countries like India and Pakistan, we don't have heat is a problem, but we have sort of, now we normally say we have 6 weathers instead of 4. We used to have winter, summer, autumn, and spring. Now we have 1 for smog and 1 for monsoon or flooding, in other words. So we have 6 seasons which we can predict when they are going to start, when they're going to end, how bad they are going to be, pretty much exactly how we could have done it across the 4 seasons. So, and this is how the media works in Pakistan. So suddenly when the smog season begins, the media is going to talk about this from November till the end of probably January. There's going to be a lot of discussion on that. And then suddenly there is a drop. But I think what happened in the last year was extreme political and economic turmoil in the country, where the news has been solely focused on how to get out of that crisis, and seems like there is the climate, the existential crisis seems like has taken a back seat. And I have spoken to different people in Pakistan as well, journalists who are covering it. They are talking about the same thing, that people are much more interested in talking about these immediate things, how to get this crisis over with. And then they are, going to talk about climate change. And remember, we are talking about a country of 240 million people where the situation is much more dire compared to probably countries in Western Europe or in North America. But somehow they believe that they would survive the day. But the political or economic challenges need to be solved rather immediately.
Yeah. And that question is from Hamad Sarfaraz, also, I think, a network member from Pakistan. Kat, there's a question about disinformation, which I think we've addressed, but there's a second part to it, which is how do we navigate this on social media? And I think that's probably something, our community is thinking about, which is, I think about video, but do I also think about the platforms where I want to talk about this? Do I want to do TikTok videos? Do I want to be on Instagram? Do I want to make YouTube shorts? Do I want to do none of the above?
Are they talking in terms of the responses they would get or the engagement they might get?
Yeah, I think it's, yeah.
Don't, we do, Ivan, maybe you have a better answer on this one.
Now, how many people get their news from influencers or
We-
compared to?
We don't really ask about the influencers per se. We just focus on different platforms, and social media and online platforms are sort of distinguished by,
That's one.
you know, by individual naming individual platforms, and the specific platforms, like for example, Carbon Brief is being sort of touted as online special online platform. So we don't really talk. We have sort of clubbed social media together. Otherwise, it would have been, you know, there are so many platforms to talk about actually. So it would have been a very long question.
No, I think we have to. I mean, I think which news media are successful on TikTok?
Ivan!
No, very successful. I think a lot of influencers are.
News media it's only just begun their journey on TikTok, hasn't it? Were they even present there?
No, but I think
till last-
some influencers, so some individuals,
Yeah.
have bigger audiences generally
That is
than us,
That is
right?
right.
So we try and we do great stuff.
Yeah.
Us and others that do even better. But I think the challenge is where do those influencers, those individuals who have a big audience, where do they get their news, and how do we work with them, or how do we make sure they put out rigorous stuff?
Am I reading from what you're saying that the idea is not to be think about the platforms, but think about the stories and sort of keep it in your specific organization and on your platform? Is that
no? I mean, I want to know. My question, it's more of a question. Those
Yeah.
individuals, those influencers on TikTok who have a big audience, where do they get their news from themselves? This is who we have to reach in a way.
it's the same thing as the community notes, isn't it? Where are the community notes coming from? Where did they get that information?
I have a note, because I was a little confused
Yeah.
by the question, but I did have something to say where now it feels, and I've heard this in very like off, behind the scenes conversations sometimes with people very senior at news organizations, where they will talk about the level of disinformation they will talk about the level of harassment the reporters get. Everything will be picked, and they'll get these horrible messages on Twitter. And it is interesting sometimes because you're hearing this, and this is not a nice experience. And obviously news organizations should think about how to keep their reporters safe. But I also think there is a danger, even among a lot of news organizations, about conflating the people who spend loads and loads of time spreading disinformation and harassing journalists online as being a sizable part of the news audience. Because I think in the report there, it says like how many people, what percentage of people actually do not believe that climate change is happening. And am I wrong in saying it's something like 8%?
Yeah.
It's really small.
Very low.
It's really small, and that number includes the United States. Let's, come on, right? They're probably skewing the numbers.
She's not
there.
just saying that because she's Canadian.
But like, look at the numbers in the United States. I talked to Yvonne on the way here. Like, it's so polarized too. We're all consuming bucket loads of American political news every day. I'm not saying that's the wrong choice, but we're doing it. We're just like taking a shower in it. And sometimes we're forgetting how extreme the US is, and how extreme the polarization is, and how extreme the disinformation coming from the top. And we are conflating being loud with being a large majority of people. So I have spoken to news bosses where they basically say that they try not to do that much climate coverage because the blowback is so bad. And I'm thinking, well, you're letting a bunch of really angry retired people dictate your news strategy. I mean, come on. We know people care. We know it's hard for them to think about. We know it can be depressing and lack novelty, but they do care and they do believe in this stuff. So, that is something I would say I do think it's really important. And usually it's coming from the top, not some retired guy online. Like, let's be clear where it's coming from. But I would not let that derail your strategy. I would try to build a climate strategy for the people who actually matter, which is the vast majority of your audience, over 90%. So that's what I say about disinformation.
Yeah, and
I really got like freaked out.
I was just going to say you will be surprised how many old and retired people there are in India. Some of them go on to have political careers, and then many of them find their way on social media. We have
Nothing against the retired people, by
No,
the way.
no.
We love them. They consume a lot of news. So
we have only about 8 or 9 minutes left, and I want to hold this space for you to express, your thoughts about this. And I think the one that I want to hold on to is that it is still the case that the news media is responsible for the bulk of people's engagement with climate news and information. And I hold that personally quite close. Because, what do we want news publishers to take away from this? And it's the same question for all of you.
Well, this seems like a very easy question, but very difficult to take on. And I have been asked this question many, many times. Honestly, the right answer would be there is no one size fit all solution here. You have to, I think if there's one thing that news organization can pivot is just focus on your audience specifically, that those audience analytics would tell you a lot. Because I have heard people I have been in a room with people from Denmark, and they have told me, the editor have told me the fascinating story, how a long form journalistic piece about how to build a sustainable house in Denmark has done tremendously well against, I would say, I personally thought that long form journalism is pretty much gone now. But he explained to me that how detailed the piece was, in a sense that how to source the lumber from, how to get the sustainable choices to buy things from in order to make a sustainable house in Denmark. Come on. In Denmark, you expect people are already very conscious about environmental issues, but still they wanted to pay attention to these things. So I think it is very much audience centric. It should be. You can't have one kind of story works across contexts. I have seen that in Pakistan as well. People do not want to, and journalists actually, this is, I know a lot of journalists won't like it, but people can see through the rehashing of climate stories. And I have people confided with me that this is what they have been doing. And that's partly the reason that people are kind of disengaging, or sometimes they do not feel like reading that. So I would say that if focus on your audience, if you have an audience of young people, they would want to know the solution, what to do, and very hyper-local context, despite this being a global issue, but the solutions and how to talk about this comes from a very, very, like you mentioned, it comes from very localized contexts.
It's clear the media is in the worst crisis of its modern history, for sure. But people still believe in truth, and we see it in your reports, right? The proportion of people that trust scientists is the highest, right? There's some countries that's really high. So people trust scientists. It feels like everything's changing. We're in a cultural revolution where there's no more truth or lies, but actually, no, people believe in truth. And so we have to adapt, we have to change, clearly. Or we won't survive. We have AI, there's a lot of things that are changing. And there's a lot of problems with, we're attacked, harassed, but still people believe we have to fight. The value of truth is still there, right? Still a lot of people want it.
Yeah, I was gonna say, something I kind of say over and over and over again, but we're gonna cover climate change, and it doesn't matter how chaotic and awful, I should not be biased, Trump is, but we're still going to cover it because Los Angeles was still on fire and Pakistan was still underwater, and these are still huge stories. So we've had a choice for the last several years, and we still face a choice, we're going to cover them, so are you going to do it well? You have to do it. Why don't you do it better? And also, I would say, from a gun, we're having this conversation where it's actually interesting because there's a lot of, when people are putting the time, the resources, and the effort in, they're experimenting a lot with climate journalism. And when we figure out some of these things on climate journalism, when we can figure out climate stories that do really, really well, which NRK in Norway, again, an insanely popular story about the climate and the sea that every single person in Norway apparently read 5 times. It was crazy. Once these stories do well, what was my point? I lost my point.
What should news publishers take away from this?
No point.
I was
I think climate journalists are rethinking the way they do
Yeah, yeah.
journalism like crazy, and it's been happening for years, right? Everyone's is up to solutions journalism. Yeah, I don't think political journalism or foreign affairs journalism, or the way we cover conflicts, geopolitics,
You just have to
diplomacy.
Go through that many
Yeah,
cycles.
so, you know.
Yeah, and they're in a crisis too. I mean, come on, we're all in a crisis together, let's be honest. But we see that political journalism is really in a crisis. And if we can figure some of this out, we can experiment, use some of these things, push back against some of the conventions, you know, then the political desk can start following what we're doing. And I think that would be great.
I think the Slido may have ended somewhere between optimistic and pessimistic, but thank you to my panelists. I think we're out of time for our online conversation. I want to say that we're in a room at the Reuters Institute, and we have an in-person audience, which is outstanding mid-career journalists from across the world, and we're going to be having more of a detailed conversation after this. But thank you to everyone that's joined in. If you found this fascinating and you want to engage with it more, you can head to our website for Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism. You can subscribe to our newsletter. And if you want to be a part of the Oxford Climate Network, we open up applications every September. So look out for that. Write to us. We want to engage with people who want to engage with climate. I'm going to take a beat here to thank our panelists. And of course, thank you all for joining in. This is the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism. Goodbye.